In this passage, Jesus confronts his disciples with a harsh reality of his impending suffering and crucifixion. The disciples are caught on their ambitions and expectations and struggle to accept the brutal truth. The passage invites us to reflect on the role of suffering in our lives and in the lives of those around us. It challenges us to examine our attitudes towards suffering and consider how we may be excluding ourselves from the pain and suffering of others. Across various historical eras, leaders have frequently aimed to insulate themselves from the struggles of those under their authority. This pattern is observed in national governments and religious hierarchies, where leaders commonly detach themselves from the adversities experienced by the people. During the French Revolution, numerous aristocrats in leadership positions were unaware of the hardships faced by the ordinary people. They resided in a realm of privilege and extravagance, contrasting sharply with the widespread struggle for survival experienced by most of the population. In our modern society, it is not uncommon to witness leaders who seem detached from the everyday struggles of regular individuals. The detachment often leads to decisions to harm others. At the same time, these leaders remain shielded from the direct fallout of their choices. The burden of suffering often falls heavily on those most vulnerable in society: women, people of color, children, and other marginalized groups are disproportionately impacted by poverty, violence, and injustice. At the same time, those in leadership positions may be shielded from these harsh realities. Think about it. There's a lot of politicians who are willing to make cuts to Medicare, Medicaid. They want to change Social Security. But will that affect them directly? Will it affect their pocket? Do they have to worry about health insurance like most of us do? Those of you who are retired, who still have to balance to be able to pay for your medicines or your doctor's visits, or God forbid, there's an unexpected surgery you have to take care of. We pay for their insurance, so they have hell of a good insurance. But what happens to the rest of us? This past week, Pope Francis made a comment about our coming election, saying that it would be voting for the lesser evil of the two. And while I want to respect him for his role in the Catholic Church, there's probably a reason why I left the Catholic Church in the first place. And part of that is he is detached, not the politic part, but how about he takes care of the internal orders in his house by making sure that clergy are not abusing children or sexually assaulting women or living beyond their means, where they're building extravagant houses and their parsonages, instead of meddling into voting for the lesser evil of our politicians. Now, I was not the only one. I read several comments on that news story where people felt the same way. Why are you opening your mouth when you can't take care of your own household? See, it doesn't affect him. Whoever is the president is going to try to work with him one way or another. Because let's face it, there's a reason why churches are also sanctuaries. And I'm not talking about the actual sanctuary, the sanctuary for undocumented immigrants. And the federal government, majority of the time since the 80s, will not step inside when there is an undocumented immigrant. Why is that? Now, I know most of you are young, you're in your 20s, so maybe you haven't thought about it. But it's just not good publicity. It is not good publicity. Just like whoever becomes president, it's not good publicity not to have a decent relationship with the Pope. We want to say that there's a definitive line between politics and religion, but we know, at least in this country, there isn't. Now, I've told you before, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. That is not my job. And let's face it, I am no fool in putting in jeopardy our tax-exempt status. My job is just to encourage you to vote for the person you feel that at the end of the day, you can have a good night's sleep saying, I helped choose that person. That's all my job is as your teacher and pastor. That's it. It is not to tell you to go vote for Jacob. Write him in. No. Please don't. But you get it. See, how many politicians don't we have, even in our state, who are making decisions where they're essentially immune because it does not affect them? We have people that are itching to cut even more the lunch programs, the breakfast programs in schools. Now, as adults, we don't go to school anymore, but maybe we know a kid, child, grandchild, niece, nephew, you name it, who's going to school and they see their little friend who, once it comes to lunch, they're scarfing down that food because that might be the only meal they get. And we have politicians who sometimes send their kids to private school, so that means they can afford the food on their table, busy trying to cut. And what happens? People like us, people like our congregation, turn around and we say we need to feed them. Why is it that we give repeatedly to the food pantry? Is it just because we're like, oh, good for us? Because I haven't seen you all do that, unless you do it in private where I can't see you. You do it because you want to, because you know that there's a need. Now we've also added on the backpack project. Why do we do that? It's another reason. To feed those kids. They're a vulnerable population. There are people in our congregation who just hit retirement, who may be struggling to pay for their medication, who may be struggling to pay for their taxes. Yet we have people saying, we need to put more taxes on the board. What happens? They're already on a tight budget. Now I can imagine even those of you who are comfortable have probably had that fine event where you squeeze through financially. Now imagine someone who has way less in their pocket, your age, who's worked their entire life just like you. And some of you who may have remained home as a full-time mom, that people say, oh, well, so you didn't work? The hell you didn't. Let's face it, you were the CEO of your household. Because how many full-time moms don't have to get up really early, make sure their kids are ready for school, make sure they have their lunch if they're taking the lunch, make sure they're clean and groomed, and then making sure that if their husband is taking a lunch, that their husband's lunch is packed. And then you have a whole bunch of other stuff to do in between, maybe volunteering. Then you gotta get the kids, make sure they're fed, showered. You know the drill more than I do. What happens? It's draining, right? And at the end of the day, how many thank yous do you get? Not many. Now, those of you who are just hitting retirement age, you want to enjoy retirement age, right? Yet we have politicians who are saying, well, why don't you get grandma or grandpa, your great aunt or uncle or whoever, to help you provide child care for you? Now, how many of you here, be honest, want to go and do child care all day long? Raise your hand, don't be shy. Okay, you don't count, Nancy. Most of you don't, right? You're like, hey, I've done a lot of that. I want to enjoy my time that I have left, right? Enjoying traveling. How many of our congregants don't travel? Like, we know Rita, number one, not number two, is always traveling, and she always forgets to tell me when to pack my bags. And I keep telling her, remind me ahead of time. She's like, I will be back in a week, I'll be back in 2 weeks. And then Laura left to Italy. She said, I'm leaving. I said, okay, but when do I leave? See, we want to enjoy, even though Laura's not retired. She's still really working and busy. We need to remember that at some point, something will affect us that our leaders put in place. One way or another. Even if you're a white heterosexual male, there's going to be a policy or two made to hurt you. So when you go into the voting booth, make sure you're well informed on who you're going to vote for. Again, I'm not going to tell you one way or another because that is none of my business. And if you know, I don't encourage you and I'm like, hey, Ruth, who you gonna vote for? Because I really don't want to know. That is between her and herself. And Earth if she wants to share it with them. Why? That is not my job to advise you on that. My job is just, as a Christian leader, to encourage you to vote for the best choice you feel is going to do the greater good. That's it. See, during the pandemic, there was a lot of disparities highlighted in health outcomes and economic impact. Think about that. How many of you know someone who they say, oh, well, they died because of complications from COVID, but really it's because they couldn't afford health care? I'm sure we all know at least one person who had complications or was afraid to go to the doctor because they couldn't afford it. What happens? It's not just COVID, it's still now. See, like my mom, I've talked about her often. When she was seeking treatment at MD Anderson, she missed the line by that much for getting assistance because she had too much in her savings. That it was enough to let them survive, but not enough to pay for all the treatment she was getting. So what happens to those of you who are in that same situation? It gets stressful. Some of you share that with me and some of you don't. But remember that if you're ever in a bind, and I know most of you, if not all of you know that by now, is that my door's open. And literally, most of the time it is open. I know Alice enjoyed it in the very beginning when I started because she would just go in there and sit down. It's like, so how you doing, Pastor? I was like, well, yes, she's getting comfortable. But what does that say too, right? You want that door open. with Carolyn and Jean when they were visitors, did we treat them any different? No. We welcomed them. And I'll keep using Mandy as an example, especially with Elaine. She treated you just like if you were here for the longest time. That's what helped her feel comfortable when she came in person. What does that say? That is what our leaders are supposed to do, is make you feel like you're part of that space and not a burden, a thorn. Communities of color were also disproportionately affected by the virus, and many people lost their jobs and homes as a result of the economic shutdown. The ongoing conflict in Palestine has led to the displacement of millions of people, forcing them to leave their homes and seek safety in neighboring countries. Some, as we know, have lost their lives. Their neighborhoods, their cities are being destroyed, demolished, literally with tractors. These individuals face significant challenges, including limited food, shelter, and health care access. And we don't have to go that far. If we pay attention, somewhere in a street corner, we're going to find someone who's without a home. And we know a big portion of that are veterans. And I know this congregation has huge support and love for veterans. How does that make you feel? My dad was a veteran, and had he been on the street, that would have broken my heart. It doesn't matter if they were actively in war or not. The point is they're veterans. We're supposed to care for them. Conflicts around the world, in this country, in this state, in this city, has created a humanitarian crisis, with many families struggling to meet their basic needs and find a sense of security. The displacement has had a profound impact on their lives, just like the lives of the Palestinians, leading to a desperate need for international support and assistance. Again, I will ask you to reflect on why is it that our country is so hardcore on supporting Ukraine against Russia, but it's not the same for Palestinians against the Israeli government. Now notice I said Israeli government. There's a difference, because if you pay attention, there's a lot of Jewish people, including rabbis around the world, who are speaking against what's happening. They are not in support of the Israeli government's actions. And those are two different things. So when I hear things of like, oh, well, all Jews is all, no. Just like we know not all Christians are hateful. Because then we're in the wrong place. Leaders in countries like ours turn a blind eye to those situations. They even advocate for their killing. How many politicians haven't you heard? Just finish it. Think about that. Meanwhile, in countries like the Ukraine, mainly white populations, they do the opposite. Let's give them the money they need to support themselves. Those in positions of power often ignore or minimize the suffering of these vulnerable populations. Right now, and maybe you're not in support of it, and that's okay, but women have lost the right to do partially what to do with their bodies. And while it might not affect some of you because you're like, I'm done having kids, it affects younger women who may want to have a child at one point. And how is that fair? It is not our job to do that. And I've mentioned before, that was one of the things my mom taught me, was you are a man. You have no business telling a woman what to do with her body. There was a hardcore Catholic. So what does that tell you? We must recognize and understand the systematic injustices, but they involve historically discriminating and oppressing certain groups, such as racial minorities or indigenous communities. It could also include identifying disparities in access to education, healthcare, employment opportunities, and representation in positions of power. Meaningful actions might include implementing policies promoting equity and inclusivity. Now, those two, equity and inclusivity, do not mean special privileges, because that's often what some politicians will have you believe, that by providing equity and inclusivity, you're giving them special privileges. And that's not the case. It's saying it's the level playing field. When we come to this table, is there a certain section say, well, okay, if you have one kid, you sit on this side of the table. If you don't have any kids, just wait until everybody's at the table and then you can sit behind them. Or is it a matter of everybody belongs at the table, find space? Which one is it? Which one do you prefer? I know which one I prefer. Granted, I get a front seat. But what happens to those who don't know that they belong at the table because they've been told repeatedly that there's no space for them there? What happens? What would happen if that was you? We need to reform criminal justice systems, supporting community-based initiatives, and investing in programs addressing systematic inequalities. You know, talking to some of the police officers and the current chief of police a few months ago at a presentation, I was honestly impressed by the way that this chief runs the department. I asked him a few questions in the sense of, well, what happens if you encounter someone who's transgender? How do you deal with that person? And he said, well, there's no official policy or law yet. We try to be as respectful as possible. If someone says, I prefer she, her, that's how we address them, even if that's not what's on their ID. That says a lot. Same thing when it comes to someone who's having a mental health episode. They try to do their best. And this police department, in case you didn't know, is the leading department in the state in training for mental health awareness. In fact, other departments are reaching out to them to help them along. That says quite a bit. They are trying. That means that we have to do our part as well. Many religious and philosophical, it's telling me to finish up. Tradition, suffering is viewed as an essential part of the human experience, serving as a catalyst for growth, transformation, and spiritual development. See, that's part of why the Outreach Committee has adopted Faith Forward. Why? We're moving forward with our faith, and to do so, we must be able to grow and transform ourselves. It's part of our spiritual development. For example, in Buddhism, dukkha emphasizes the pervasive nature of suffering and its role in the human condition. According to the Buddha's teachings, acknowledging and understanding suffering is the first step toward liberation and enlightenment. In Hinduism, karma is closely tied to the idea of suffering and spiritual development. The belief in the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, known as samsara, suggests that suffering can result from past actions and that overcoming is essential for spiritual evolution and eventual liberation. These examples illustrate how different faith traditions recognize suffering as a crucial element in the human journey towards spiritual growth and enlightenment. The book of Job in Hebrew Bible is a timeless example of the correlation between suffering and faith. It tells the story of Job, a virtuous man who faces profound suffering but remains steadfast in his belief in God's sovereignty and benevolence. Job's experiences prompt deep philosophical and theological reflections on the nature of suffering and faith. Likewise, in Christianity, the cross of Jesus Christ symbolizes suffering and redemption. According to Christian belief, Jesus willingly endured crucifixion to offer salvation to those who have faith in him. And we heard that today. This act of ultimate sacrifice and triumph over suffering is central to the Christian faith. It serves as a powerful symbol of hope and redemption for believers. Jesus' words in Mark 8:34 are a powerful call to discipleship. He invites us to take a part of our cross and follow him. This implies a willingness to suffer for the gospel's sake and live a life of self-denial. However, it is essential to know that following Jesus does not necessarily mean experiencing physical suffering, which some Christian leaders would have you believe as well. Well, we have to think of why you were assaulted. We have to think of why you were abused and see what that means. It means that there was just a horrible person who took an opportunity to harm you. It being willing to sacrifice our desires and ambitions for the sake of others. We can follow Jesus by engaging in specific actions such as volunteering at a soup kitchen, a homeless shelter, to help those in need. We can advocate for social justice by participating in rallies, signing petitions, supporting organizations that work towards positive change in our communities and beyond. It means simply being a friend to someone who is struggling by offering a listening ear, emotional support, or practical help in a way to embody the teachings of Jesus. The passage from Mark today challenges us to reflect on the role of suffering in our lives and those around us. It reminds us that leadership should be a servant's heart and that we should be mindful of the suffering of others. So let us be inspired by Jesus' example, who was willing to endure suffering for the gospel's sake. Let us strive to follow him, not only in our words, but also in our actions. And let us remember that our faith is tested, not only in times of prosperity, but also in times of hardship. Amen.